Welcome to our behind the scenes conversation about After the Buses, a collaboration between Borderless magazine and Block Club Chicago. We are so excited to be here and thank you so much for joining us this Wednesday evening. I'm Diane Bukhalil, Borderless magazine's engagement reporter. A little bit about Borderless magazine. We are a nonprofit news outlet covering labor, justice, and advocacy issues impacting Midwestern immigrant communities through a lens of equity and resilience. And Block Club Chicago is a nonprofit news organization dedicated to delivering reliable, nonpartisan, and essential coverage of Chicago's diverse neighborhoods. As you may have heard, last week we published the series After the Buses, where Block Club Chicago and Borderless magazine reporters introduced readers to 10 of thousands of migrants that were sent to Chicago from Texas. Tonight's conversation will give you some insights about why and how we went into this 3-month-long project. Joining us today are some of the journalists who reported these stories. Ambar Colón is a journalist who works for the Chicago Sun-Times Spanish section, La Voz Chicago. Madison Savedra is a reporter at Block Club Chicago. Jesus J. Montero is a freelance journalist, producer, and photographer. And Colin Boyle is a reporter and photographer at Block Club Chicago. Before we get started, I wanted to mention that both Block Club Chicago and Borderless are fundraising right now. And if community journalism matters to you and you would like to see more of our reporting and projects like these, please consider donating. We'll put our donation links in the chat. Also, we'll be sure to leave some time at the end for questions. Reporters, congrats on the publishing of the series. A lot of hard work the past 3 months. Let's get started by talking about the early stages of this project. Madison, I'm going to start with you. Could you explain where this idea of the project came about?
Absolutely. So I would say it started kind of the first day that these buses started showing up at Chicago's Union Station from Texas. So I believe the first one came August 31st. And by the end of that week, I believe it was a Wednesday, by the end of that week, I and my colleague at Block Club, Colin, had kind of been tapped to start looking into it, trying to figure out what the city's response was. Where were all these people staying? How are they getting resources for them, like, food, water, clothes? What were their feelings? Like, what were their reactions? Like, did they know where they were coming from? Kind of stuff like that. And almost immediately, we knew that we wanted to start working on a bigger project. So we did a handful of stories, kind of just giving context of like the, bus arrivals. Like Colin and I, and actually you, Diane, and Jesus spent a couple afternoons at Union Station as the buses were arriving, like meeting people, greeting people, trying to make some connections. And we knew that we immediately wanted to like start on a broader story, kind of something bigger that eventually developed into After the Buses. We knew we wanted something that went a little bit deeper, not just announcing that, all of these thousands of people were soon to come to Chicago, but what were their stories? What were their feelings? What was their plan? How are they adjusting to the city? So those were kind of those initial questions we were asking ourselves. And, we got started pretty much right away and spent almost 3 months working on it.
Yeah, and when people, you mentioned like you were there many times, not just once when the buses were arriving. So how did you get a hold of people? How did you reach people and gain their trust? I can speak to, for Borderless, we gave out flyers that said in Spanish, do you want to share your story with a reporter? And with our contact info for them to message us and call us. So we could reach the individuals and follow up with them because, yes, a lot of them had cell phones, but they didn't have access to Wi-Fi right away. They didn't have active numbers that worked in the US or active numbers at all. And so it was a way for them to just reach out to us when they did have when they were able to later, when things were less hectic as well, because as you saw at the Union Station, things were pretty hectic. So yeah, if you could explain how you reached people and especially earning their trust, both Madison, Colin.
Yeah, I think we probably all went about connecting with sources in a different way, which I think is really cool. I can say the way that I connected with kind of my three, main sources, the three stories that I worked on, it involved just kind of going up to people who were hanging out outside of the temporary shelters. So one of the biggest ones that everyone kind of knew about was a Salvation Army shelter in Humboldt Park. Colin was with me one day, and actually we did spend a couple afternoons there. But on this one particular day, we showed up, and there were a group of young men hanging out outside, which I think they did pretty frequently. Exploring the neighborhood, kind of wanting to get out of the big gymnasium they were staying in, and we just struck up a conversation. Obviously, very transparent that we were reporters, like explaining, what we do, like the project that we were working on. And right off the bat, they were super enthusiastic about it. Like, we're more than happy to share their stories with us, and take time, out of their busy schedules. I mean, every single one of them was looking for a job, like on a daily basis. So these guys had phones, luckily, so it made connecting with them, via WhatsApp, pretty easy. But another one of my stories that I worked on, the young man who I met through a connection that I had with a nonprofit, he
Mhm.
didn't have a cell phone for like the first 3 or 4 weeks. So I
Mhm.
met him, we chatted, he seemed really open and like willing to talk, but then I didn't hear from him because I gave him my phone number, told him to, let me know if he got a phone, but I didn't know if he would.
Yeah.
He did, he reached out, and it worked out. Colin, if you want to speak to a little bit about how you
Absolutely. Yeah. So, just growing up in Chicago, it's a city that's incredibly well connected despite it being millions of people living here. And the way I met the gentleman who I featured in my part of the series here, David, was just on happenstance. I was covering a Dia de los Muertos event in Pilsen,
Mhm.
and I ran into a colleague of mine, the kid from Pilsen, who's an activist and photographer and community organizer, a little bit younger than me, but just incredibly engaged and connected in the city. And I ran into him at the event, and he was like, Colin, I would love you to meet my new friend. His name is David. He came here from Venezuela by the buses, and he's been out looking for work. And the way that they connected was David was actually walking around 18th Street in Pilsen and was asking everyone like if they spoke Spanish and if they had any work for him. And he ran into a kid, and the kid said, yes, I would love for you to, I could train you to be a photographer. And that obviously struck a chord with me. I'm a photojournalist here at Block Club, but also it flourished into such a beautiful friendship and support system where the kid is able to like pay David to be his photographer and to learn with with the kid's camera gear. And so just, the big picture that came out of it for me was just always being open and for anything, especially as a reporter, just to take in these stories and to connect with folks. And from there, I followed up with David a few times, met with him for coffee, sat down with him, learned about his journey here, his daughter back at home, and his wife and his family, whom he's been working for 5 years in Colombia before coming to Chicago, to raise money for. So it just was happenstance and just being ready for a story and a connection, just the way that David and the kid from Pilsen were ready to meet each other and connect with one another and change each other's lives.
Yeah. And what about how you were reporting and taking photos at the arrivals of the buses? Because of course you have to be mindful, like it's a really hectic scenery, they're just arriving not only to the US, but to Chicago, this really long bus ride. They don't know really much of their environment where they are. And so, not everyone wants a camera in their face the minute they arrive after such a long trip. So how did you, as a photojournalist, how did you navigate your way through, reporting this?
It was a lot of trial and error, just reading the room, reading the environment. Many of those days where we spent sitting outside Union Station, you never knew when the buses were going to come in because communication was purposely not well maintained between Texas and here. And so the element of surprise played into it, and we just had to navigate that comfortably with those around us. What I noticed about how Jesus and I managed our documentation as photojournalists versus some other outlets is we kind of stayed back a little bit. When the buses arrived, we'd kind of pull back a little bit, use a longer lens to kind of zoom in a bit and make more, I don't want to say tasteful, but more thoughtful pieces of imagery that still conveyed a story without possibly putting people at risk by showing their likeness when they immediately arrive. Or if we did make those photos, we'd sit down and really think about what images we'd end up sending out to the paper or posting online. And so the way we handled that was, scaling back. I always think back to a photo that Jesus made where he only photographed this gentleman's like sandal as he stepped off the bus.
Mm-hmm.
And, just the imagery, the power of that image where that seeing that sandal spoke a lot to Jesus, and that photo was one of the lead images that he shared from that day, and it got a lot of attention. And then, of course, when people were being rushed from from the bus from Texas to the shuttle bus to the shelter, we would try to either photograph from behind of their heads so you don't always see their faces, or if people were idling, because some folks would not actually choose to take the shuttle, they'd rather wait for friends or family or friends of friends to come to Union Station to pick them up. That's when we would kind of come up after the TV cameras had left, after other reporters had left, and kind of make a connection, approach them speaking Spanish, being vulnerable, letting them know what we're doing here and what our intentions are, and then asking if we can make their portrait, and just conveying, what journalism is here and what we're trying to do, and just being open for questions as well.
Yeah, if I can add on to that just a little bit, and Colin nailed it right on the head. I think that's what's been special about this project in general, is this thoughtfulness and intentional reporting through all aspects, through interviews, and what Colin just mentioned too, and Diane, brought up the first initial signs of these migrants coming in is these buses, and we saw time and time again these past few years, migrants, immigrants, refugees being sensationalized as talking points, as as filler, especially in like TV news. But what I liked about this project and the journalists that worked on here is the ethical guidelines that we had within ourselves as journalists there, being on the ground first, and then the ethical guidelines we had throughout the rest of the project. So just echoing Colin's point of view of just being very intentional, very straightforward. Also too, I remember a handful of times I was there and I saw a good photo, right? But I didn't, because it would have, overstepped personal boundaries or guidelines. At the end of the day, these are people that we're interviewing. These are people that we're capturing. I know it's like the old fable of like, how would you like to be treated? And in essence, I feel some familiarity with these people. As I think it's important center that journalists have to be ethical within their reporting. I think we did that with this project.
Yeah, and Ambar, let's talk about the story that you wrote. You wrote a story about a family. So how did you find them? And how was the process? What were some challenges?
Yeah, so I spoke with Tomas, Carmen, and their 2-year-old daughter, Grecia. I met them by contacting La Doctora Anahil Garcia. She's one of the founding members of the Illinois Venezuelan Alliance, which is a nonprofit. So I reached out to her. I told her a little bit about the project, and she told me she immediately knew who she wanted to connect me with, because I was kind of searching specifically for a family to talk to. So she got me in touch with them, and we started communicating over WhatsApp. They live on the Northwest side, so I decided to meet them where they were at. And yeah, it was, over, like many of you have already mentioned, like over several months, weeks of, continuously speaking with them, whether it's meeting with them, bringing them coffee, just talking about, checking in with everyday life and things like that. I think really helped to get them to share more about their journey to the States, what they need and what they're looking for out of being here in Chicago. So yeah, they're great. I think one thing that stood out to me is that they were very willing to talk to somebody and put their story out there, especially because they have a 2-year-old daughter. And like many of the people that we all interviewed, they have children either here with them or back home. And the biggest thing that you're worried about as a parent is like, I want my child to be healthy. So that was like a big theme in all of our conversations and things like that. But yeah.
Yeah, and speaking of Dr. Ana Hill Garcia, before the publishing of the series, we did a Q&A with her to understand why Venezuelans are leaving Venezuela and, why are they coming to the US? And she gave us such a detailed, explanation or explanations. And we'll definitely link that story in the chat as well. And so, Ambar, once you gained people's trust and the family's trust in this case, could you walk us through, how you did the interviews? Because all of you did the reporting in Spanish, which was, something really important to mention. This was 3 months of Spanish reporting and a lot of translation, to English, to Spanish. And so, could you walk us through the interview process and how you made sure everything is accurate as well?
Mm-hmm. So again, all the reporting was done in Spanish. I did encounter some like struggles because it's Venezuelan Spanish. So I think that was probably like the most difficult part about it being reporting that was done in Spanish, because it's not a dialect that we really hear often in Chicago. Or now we'll be hearing probably a lot more of it. So again, I met them at their home, which is they're staying in the basement of a woman. So they met a woman in Peru where they lived for 4 years. Again, like many of the people that we interviewed, they left Venezuela to go to a different Latin American country before they eventually made it here. So while they spent 4 years in Peru, they had a neighbor who eventually left, came to Chicago. They stayed in contact with her. So she was the only person that they knew in Chicago. So they're staying in like the basement of the house that she is staying in. So I met them there. Obviously I'm like recording and stuff like that. So it was a lot of conversations about obviously what it took to get here, and then also, like I mentioned, what they need, what their dreams and hopes are and stuff like that. So it was kind of really hard to like splice all of that information and put it into the articles that you all can see are the final result. And of course we had to do some fact checking. So that again just required more of that following up, more of that checking in, more of, like, is this what you said? So yeah, I think that maybe was probably the most tedious part of it. But I for me, everything was like really enjoyable, and you learn something different about our, that approach to journalism that really lets them put their story front and center, without like us really having to go in, interject, and describe what's happening. They're telling their own story. So I think that's also like the most beautiful part of this.
Yeah, I like the, how you mentioned like they're telling their own story and they want to share it and it's in their own voice. Borderless does, we publish the stories in the As Told To method, which is a first person storytelling method where, they talk about their experience in their own voice. I know Ambar and Jesus, that's the method that you guys published your stories in. and it empowers immigrants in a way because it's, they have the, full control of how the story is being told. And maybe Jesus, you could talk a little bit about your story that you wrote, and what did you find the biggest challenges were for the person you talked to?
If I could add real quick, I also think that like that piece of them being able to tell their own stories is really important, and I think probably impactful for them coming from Venezuela, where most, not if not all, of the media is controlled by the state. So I think that's really like meaningful and something that they've never experienced before.
Mm.
Yeah, that's what I I agree on about, and I think that's something I conveyed with the person I spoke with, Omar. This story is going to be told through his perspective, and that was an interesting concept that took a second for him to kind of realize, which is incredibly powerful considering the country that they came from, Venezuela. With Omar specifically, he is a young father who, like many others, went to a neighboring Latin America country to fend or make a better life for himself, but looked for opportunities here in the United States. So I talked to him in his journeys to get here. I think the biggest hurdle that people like Omar and many of the people we have here are, natural resources that we often take for granted. Resources like coats, jackets, mittens. For a lot of these migrants, work gloves, work boots, obviously housing, and more importantly, just a form of income or job, just so they can provide for their families back at home. I think also too, the biggest thing that a lot of, especially with Omar, that he's dealing with currently is the toll he had, the toll on his body after months of traveling. That's something that's now settling, or he shares with me, going through the jungles of Peru and the amounts of traveling he did. He tells me, even though he's a young man, his body hurts. But also too, the biggest thing that he's dealing with now is the sadness of being away from his family. I feel like that's a lot of the different migrants here talking about these experiences that they've had has forced them to revisit very traumatic experiences. And a lot of them are unaware of it, but they've, have, forms of PTSD because of this, the things that they've seen, the people they've come across, the hard terrain, and oftentimes the death that they've seen on these paths. So I didn't want to tell Omar that, but I think that's something he's going to be dealing with for quite some time. So aside from resources, obviously money to provide for his family, he's also, still dealing with the pain or the journey that he went through.
Yeah, and I think you're muted.
Thank you, Ambar. So a lot of everyone that you wrote the stories about, they loved the outcome, and they wanted to share their story. And so, back to Colin and Madison, what were the reactions of the people that you interviewed, and even the communities that you may have reached?
I know for me, like the reaction from the folks I interviewed has been, really great. I think they're really happy with how it turned out, really proud. I think they liked the photographs that like Colin took, at least for my stories. Doing those photo sessions was, I think we all had a good time. It was fun. They got to, I don't think they had ever done like a photo session like that before. So I think they had a good time and were happy with how they turned out in the story. And then just from the community at large, I mean, like it really meant a lot, I think, to me and to probably all of us, how many people have responded with such like warm wishes and the fact that people took time to read all of our stories, because there are 8 stories and they're pretty long and it's not a super light topic. So the fact that people were interested enough and engaged enough in this topic to not only read all our stories, but share them with others, reach out to us via email. I had one person reach out and say that they had 300 adult like winter hiking boots that they wanted to donate. They wanted to know if I could point them in direction of how they could get them to some of these folks who probably don't have winter boots heading into a Chicago winter. And that's just one example of people reaching out after reading this story and wanting to do something to help, and glad they got a chance to know more.
Yeah, and for me, it was a really emotional moment. I was sitting down with David, my source, having a coffee, just doing some fact checking and follow-up questions, and ended up translating the copy that I had, the story I had, into Spanish and just reading it to him. And at points he would just kind of just sit there and just start crying to hear his own story and his own like journey through a story and back into his home language, into his native language. And it was really powerful because he wrote to me when the story was published. He said, "Okay, mi amigo, de verdad, para mí fue un placer que muchas personas puedan conocer mi historia y la de muchos de nosotros los migrantes." So, okay, my friend, for me, it was a pleasure that many people can know my story and that of us migrants. And so it was really powerful for him to, go through this journey, live it day in, day out, and just to slow down for a second and hear all he's been experiencing put into one story that people can grasp and that he can understand, that he can receive again, to comprehend, and then to share it among his family, because we had such an amazing team that translated our stories back into Spanish to share at large. So that was a really beautiful moment.
Yeah, absolutely. Putting a face to, the voices and the people that, were in the headlines. I think that's super important. So how is this project been different than the rest of, the typical reporting projects that you've done in the past? I mean, it was pretty long. It was 3 months. So it was a very in-depth project, going back and forth, meeting weekly. So, if you have any thoughts to share about how this was different than what you've done in the past.
What I found was so fantastic with this project is, we are nonprofit newsrooms. We aren't TV stations. We aren't newspapers, or, your typical practical newspaper. So we had the resources and the time to maintain on these stories for weeks, for months, after the cameras had left, after the buses had returned to Texas. And I think that was very different than a lot of reporting we find ourselves doing day in and day out as journalists in Chicago. But for us to dedicate so much time and share so much compassion and trust with our new neighbors here in Chicago was just as a lifelong Chicagoan, that was a really phenomenal experience as a journalist. And I can't wait to hear what y'all have to add on that.
Yeah, I mean, I will just add, I've never worked on a project like this before. Like, this was my first time like working on something long term. And I really have to give some credit to all of the editors from both Black Club and Borderless from behind the scenes, because they were like crucial in giving us all the time and the resources that we needed to make this project what it was, and hear all of our worries and concerns, but also all of our successes. And when we finally got the interview or we got the draft in, having them be our champions on something, especially for me, having I'd not worked on something like this before. So having their support throughout the whole thing was instrumental.
Yeah, I definitely want to, echo that. I think that the support of the editors was super helpful, especially again, given the fact that we all worked on this for 3 months. So I feel like after so many conversations, you kind of get maybe in your head about it, and there's just so much information. And of course, all of that's important, but like at the end of the day, you're trying to come up with like a piece of journalism. Like how can I make their story, I guess, look good on paper. And so they were very like helpful at like setting the scene. And there's a lot of things that I learned from this experience that I definitely will take into like my everyday reporting. Just thinking about people and like really meeting them at where they're at, and like telling those stories, putting like you said, Diane, like putting faces to names,
Mhm.
and to issues that are so much bigger than all of us. So that, I think, again, that was like the most meaningful part of it. And the family that I spoke to, they were so overjoyed with not just the photos, but like how the story came out and everything. So that is like awesome, like at the end of all the reporting that we did, to just get that response from not only like the readers but from them specifically is just super powerful. So there's again a lot that I'm going to take away from this.
Yeah, I'll chime in and just amplify what's already been shared by everybody else on the panel. It's a beautiful thing because we read about it, this issue, for the past few months as it's been growing. It still continues to grow, and to be quite frank, as like a consumer of news, but also somebody that's in it, I've never seen a project like this with this much intention and this much focus, and it's brought by two incredible organizations that have that part of their mantra, about part of their foundation, part of their reporting. So it could have only possibly been done this way, and I it's definitely proud and honor to be a part of doing something with intention, especially with what's been happening with these migrants, and also too during to the city of Chicago and how they're being treated, and how it's definitely something that we all did because we felt like we needed to. I don't know if that's how everybody else felt about it. Like you wanted to do something with intention and be very ethical and be very straightforward with a very honest project like this.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, everyone, for sharing those thoughts. And speaking of ethical reporting, what comes with ethical reporting is a lot of things. And I think also it comes with language and using the right vocabulary and using the right terms. And before the publishing of this series, we were talking a lot. You hear the word asylum, asylee, asylum seeker, migrant, and I think one of the first thoughts I had is, are these people who are coming asylum seekers? Are they refugees? And so the language, immigration terms can get a bit confusing. And so back in, I think it was October, like mid-October, I wrote a piece on like, what is asylum? Just to have an understanding of, to educate also the public of these terms. And so I'm just going to put the link also in the chat for anyone who's interested in learning more. And if anyone wants to add as well, like why we used the word migrant and not asylum seeker.
Well, I think we ultimately kind of used both. I mean, in their definitions, asylum seeker is, what it sounds like, people who plan or are in the middle of applying for asylum. But that gets tricky when, people might say they have an intention to apply for asylum, but maybe they end up not doing it, or whether, for whatever reasons. And one of those reasons might be they might not even be eligible for it. There are, I don't even know really all of the specific criteria you have to meet to, receive asylum like that. It's a pretty complicated process. And then migrant is a term that I think from our understanding is super general, like really just means like moving from one country like to another, which could apply to anybody. It could apply to somebody like moving from the United States to Europe. You could call them a migrant in its most like strictest sense, but you wouldn't call someone that. So I think the word migrant does bring a lot of like connotation with it. Like it makes people think of people who are coming to the United States, typically from the southern border. So I think we ended up going with using that term for like reader recognition, and just because it fit a bit more generally than only using asylum seeker when all the people we wrote about might not end up applying for asylum formally or even getting it.
Yeah, absolutely. An immigrant and asylum seeker could be is actually a migrant, and so and a lot of the migrants can't apply for asylum at the moment. I think they have to wait a year, and also there's this whole thing about TPS as well, and so yeah, I agree. That's why we used migrants. So I think we're gonna move.
I'm sorry.
Oh
Is
no,
it
go
okay if I
ahead.
add something?
Of course, yeah.
Just to add to that, I think it gets really complicated to know what word to use, especially like as I mentioned before, a lot of these migrants leave Venezuela to go to a different country, and they stay there for however long. And so if they're coming from a place like Peru, where there's not as glaring as an issue as there is in Venezuela right now, I think it becomes different in the eyes of like the law and what is law and how they define those things.
Exactly.
Yeah. So when reporting, before we get into the questions of questions the audience might have, I want to ask, how can people help migrants? Both Block Club and Borderless have published stories about, how to help migrants, especially now that, as you mentioned, Jesus, like coats are a really big thing and big necessity because it's really cold in Chicago, and I don't think Venezuelans or people who come from warmer places understand how really cold it can be. And also, just a bunch of things, a bunch of necessities. So while reporting for 3 months of this, what are the biggest needs of migrants, and how can Chicagoans who are watching right now help?
I would say one simple way I think people can help is through donation drives. I think there are quite a few going on through like aldermen's offices. The city still has its big Amazon wish list going on. I know there's a couple other nonprofits that have something similar. Um, Unfortunately, a lot of people's like critical needs can't necessarily be filled by the public. People need like nonprofit lawyers, like they need case managers, um, things that they can't as easily be filled by people wanting to help. But I would just encourage people to reach out to local aldermanic offices. I know they had been doing donation drives like back in September and October, and I imagine some either still are or like know the ways to help. And kind of just keep your eyes and ears open.
Yeah, I think just to add on to that, I think the whole city of Chicago is experiencing a need for assistance for these migrants. There's a lot of great city resources, a lot of great nonprofits. I think if a person truly wants to help, it's upon them to not only just do research in their area, but also to help change the conversation on this very important topic. I think in the upcoming election, presidential election, this is going to be a heavy conversation that I feel like a lot of people need to educate themselves on. Even the terminology from migrants to asylum seekers, what that necessarily means. Yeah. The journeys that these people go through, and in actuality, what they want and desire. Right? Almost everybody we spoke to was here to not only just make money, but to create their life here. Everybody, as soon as they stepped off the bus, they looked around Chicago and they were in awe. And speaking to a few of them a few weeks later, they wanted to decide to stay there. Right? They want to create their lives here. They want to contribute to the city. So I think, along with financially supporting these migrants, also changing the points of view of your peers, your friends that may have different perspectives or at least, share information that's factual and truthful about what's happening at our borders.
I also just want to emphasize the power of like the dollar as well. Like money, cash donations go a really long way for a lot of these folks, especially if they're, they have outstanding medical bills, from hospital stays, from checkups and visits for their children and things like that. Obviously, these people are uninsured, so and those costs can be very steep. So again, just wanted to emphasize like cash does help people.
Yeah, thank you all for sharing that. Before we end this live conversation, I want to ask everyone to share their favorite moment in this 3-month-long project. I'd like to share that I have favorite moments. I think I'll name a few. Of course, it's waiting at the Union Station with you all. We didn't know what was going on exactly, but we had, I don't know, we bonded over some coffee. I really enjoyed getting to know you all, throughout this project and especially at Union Station. And just learning overall, I think that this is I learned so much about Venezuela and, getting to know Dr. Ana Gil Garcia as well, and about the Illinois Venezuelan Alliance. I just wish the migrants best of luck, and especially like coming from an immigrant background, I am excited for them and I really wish them the best, because starting a new life somewhere, it can be scary, but at the same time, it can open so many new opportunities that they wouldn't have had before. So those are my favorite moments and thoughts.
I have to echo Union Station, being just in community of a lot of reporters, was both stressful and fun in hindsight, like getting to know all of you. I didn't know you guys before. Well, not you, Colin. I didn't know you guys before we started working on this project. So for that, I am super grateful. And I really enjoyed getting the opportunity to do so many interviews in Spanish. Like that has always been a goal of mine. And this project like really forced me to like practice my Spanish, practice that interview, that bilingual interview skill. So I'm super grateful for that.
What about you, Ambar?
So as mentioned, obviously I also have a lot of favorite moments. The one that sticks out the most to me though, when I like first went to meet the family, Tomas, Carmen, y Grecia, I walked in and we went to the kitchen table and Grecia was very excited, like, oh my gosh, there's a new person here. And she asked her dad, vamos a comer? And he was like, no, sorry, Grecia, we're not eating. But I like told her like, para la próxima, we'll eat next time. So that was just like a very sweet moment that I think about a lot, because she was so like eager and excited. But yeah, again, I've known a couple of you before, but meeting the rest of you has been great. And then to echo what Madison said, like doing all of this in Spanish. Obviously, I do a lot of work in Spanish already with La Voz, but this was like characteristically different in like the approach that we did. So again, just taking a lot of great things from this experience that I will never forget, obviously. So.
I can go next. Yeah, I think for the Union Station, I think was a great launch, and I'll try to paint a picture. Just imagine complete chaos with a lot of bus fumes and misdirection. As buses of migrants were coming in, we did a lot of learning on our toes, a lot of collaboration, and we started a project without essentially even coming to an agreement of like, this is what it is, just helping each other out. And obviously people that are listening or watching now are familiar with Block Club and Borderless. You know, that the work that we did from that very same start of the day to the following 3 months is definitely something that you don't see in other newsrooms. And I feel like that's what I really enjoyed, or just like working on the structure that we were able to work with each other and the stories that we were able to tell. And speaking with Omar about his journey, a state of reflection with him, being able to talk about how he got to where he was at, because of his journey, he couldn't believe it. But his journey here is like not ending, but just beginning. He's ready to work. Like I feel like all of the people we spoke to, he's ready to create. He's ready to contribute, and I feel like with this project we captured that in its most truest way. So that's probably my favorite thing, being able to capture this in a very, very honest light.
And just to wrap it up with my favorite part, besides working with such an amazing and intrepid team, was just watching our new neighbors interact around and with the camera, and watching David learn how to use a camera in real time, or hanging out with Madison's sources outside of the Salvation Army at a park over in West Humboldt Park, just setting up a light and then explaining in like what I thought was fluent Spanish, but not fluent enough to explain the intricacies of photography into Spanish, but trying to explain to them like the lighting situation and answering questions and having a conversation, and just there was just one moment where I was sitting with Milram, and he was one of Madison's sources, and he was just looking around the park, and he's like, this is just so beautiful. I just love sitting here and watching the birds, and I want to be able to document that and just like cherish that. It was just so incredible just to take that one moment of pause on a otherwise, really hectic and extended period of time that we spent reporting, just to sit there and just share a moment of nature with someone who just was plopped here in Chicago a few weeks before that, and just have that wonderful commonality right there. Now we're neighbors, right? So it was really exciting and beautiful overall.
I love that. Thank you, everyone, so much for sharing these beautiful memories and moments. And of course, thank you, reporters, for sharing the process and the behind the scenes of reporting for After the Buses. And thank you to our audience for reading our work and tuning in this evening. Please check out After the Buses on blockclubchicago.org and borderlessmag.org. And if you want to see more from our reporters and support our reporting and both our publications, please donate to the donation links linked in the chat to see more of our reporting. So thank you all so much, and until next time.
Yes, thank you, everybody, for taking time out of your Wednesday.
I forgot it was Wednesday. Thank you, everyone.
All right. Bye.